East African Community, which was formed in 1967. There are key reasons that led to the establishment of the East African Community. We are saying EAC, which was formed in 1967. Before I continue, I emphasize to you one customer, Farouk of Uganda's quote: success is sweet, but its secret is sweat. Its secret is what? Sweat. So you need to sweat today to succeed tomorrow. So we are saying the founders of EAC wanted to protect the younger industries of East Africa. The founders of EAC wanted to protect the younger industries of East Africa. So we believe that the founders of EAC wanted to protect the younger industries of East Africa. So in a bid to protect the younger industries of East Africa, they formed of EAC to support one another. That the Ugandans were to support Kenya's industries, even Tanzanian industries, and this was going to lead to development. Then to create a wider market for East African products, the EAC was formed to create a wider market for East African products. In other words, if Uganda was producing products, it had to trade with Kenya and Tanzania, and this was going to lead to development because of the great market. Then to integrate the East African economies so as to compete favorably with the external market, to unite the East African economies to be able to compete with the external market. Mind you, external market was so great. So by this, they needed to unite together to fight, to compete favorably with the external market. Another one, to create a free trade area in East Africa. There was a reason of creating a free trade area for East Africa products. In other words, not to put so many taxes around the borders. That's why EAC had to be formed. They wanted to carry out a joint exploitation and utilization of the region's natural resources. They wanted to carry out a joint exploitation and utilization of the region's natural resources. In other words, they wanted to utilize the natural resources totally. In other words, if Uganda was not willing to exploit the natural resource in Uganda, Kenya could come in, Tanzania could come in, and this was going to lead to development. Another one, the founders hoped to attain self-reliance within the East African region. The founders hoped to attain self-reliance. In other words, the founders wanted self-reliance. What's all about this? They wanted to rely on themselves. They didn't want to rely on other leading countries. So the founders wanted to attain self-reliance. That's why we are saying EAC had to be formed, because the East African region had to rely on itself, not to rely on the leading countries. They aimed at enabling free movement of capital within East Africa. They aimed at enabling the free movement of capital within East Africa. In other words, for capital to move freely within East Africa. So we need to understand free movement of capital within East Africa. Capital to move from Uganda to Kenya easily, freely, without people paying taxes. Another one, they wanted to promote balanced economic development within the East African region. They wanted to promote balanced economic development. In other words, EAC was formed to promote balanced economic development. In other words, the countries were meant to help one another to develop their countries. If Kenya was great, it could help Uganda and Tanzania. Another one, to create a wider job opportunities for East Africans. In other words, to create a wider job opportunities for East Africa. If the East Africans fail to get jobs in Kenya, they could get jobs in Uganda, in Tanzania, and this was going to help people within the region to develop. So we are saying there are key reasons why East African community was formed. They wanted to achieve political cooperation through annual discussions. So they wanted to achieve political cooperation through annual discussions. In other words, in every year, they had to discuss and they get what you call political cooperation through annual discussions. Change is rising up. They wanted to improve the provision of common social services like higher education. So they wanted to improve the provision of common social services like higher education, telecommunication. That's why ESC had to be formed. So you need to understand the key reasons why ESC was formed. Another one, they wanted to have a common currency of all East African states. There was an aim of creating a common currency of all East African states, where we believe by this time the East African states had to create a common currency. They wanted to have a common currency within the region. That was one of the reasons why ESC was formed. They wanted to fight against neocolonialism in East Africa. In other words, they didn't want the colonial powers to continue controlling East Africa. So they wanted to fight against neocolonialism in East Africa. Mind you, neocolonialism, this is colonialism after independence. So they wanted to fight against neocolonialism. Then they wanted to unite the free East African states under one body. The free East African states had to be united under one body. So you need to understand the key reasons why ESC had to be formed. They wanted to act as a strong voice on the international forum. So they wanted to act as a strong voice on the international forum. ESC was formed to act as a strong voice on the international forum. So you need to understand the key reasons why ESC was formed. In other words, it was formed to act as a strong voice on the international forum, where the East Africans could have one voice on the international forum. So you need to understand the key reasons why East African community had to be formed. Of course, there are key reasons why ESC had to be formed. So you need to understand